Mom slammed her fork down, looked me dead in the eyes, and called me a failure. Right before I told her I'd secretly paid $61,000 to stop the bank from taking her house. And if you stick with me while I share my story, and it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting subscribe, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Evan Mercer, I'm 29, and for most of my life I've been the quiet one in the family. The one who works, fixes things, shows up when needed, and never gets much in return. My mom, Diane, is the type who thinks kindness is weakness. Cold, sharp-tongued, always ready to compare me to my younger sister, Mara, the golden child. My dad, Ralph, just sits back and watches everything happen, pretending silence is the same thing as peace. That night at dinner, things felt off from the moment I walked in. The whole extended family was there, and Mom was already complaining about something. The moment I sat down, she started in on me, asking why I still hadn't figured out my life, why I wasn't as successful as Mara, why I couldn't grow up and make them proud. I'd heard it all before, but something in her tone cut deeper than usual. Maybe because I'd spent the last 2 years holding up a house that wasn't even mine. I tried to let it roll off. I always tried. But she kept going louder, sharper, until everyone at the table went quiet. Mara smirked into her glass. Dad kept pretending his plate was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. And then Mom said it. "You're a failure, Evan. You always have been." I don't know what snapped in me, but I finally looked up and said, "A failure? I paid your mortgage for 2 years. $61,000. Without me, the bank would have taken this house." For a moment, everything froze. The room went silent. My mom's face drained of color. But instead of softening, instead of even pretending to appreciate what I'd done, she pushed her chair back and said, "So what? You want a medal? You only did it to make us look weak." Mara jumped in instantly, calling me a liar, saying I just wanted attention. My dad finally looked up, confused but still too afraid of Mom to say anything that might calm the room. So I pulled out the receipts, the foreclosure notices I'd found hidden in their drawers, the payment records I'd kept because some part of me knew this day would come. Mom stared at the papers like they were an attack. Then she stood, pointed toward the door, and told me if I wanted to act like a martyr, I could leave her house. And that was the moment I realized. No matter what I gave, no matter how much I sacrificed, they were never going to see me as anything but the problem. And this was only the beginning. Evan still remembered the day he found the first foreclosure notice. He hadn't been snooping. He'd simply gone into the hallway cabinet looking for batteries. But the drawer jammed, and when he pulled harder, a stack of unopened envelopes spilled onto the floor. The bright red letters screamed urgent. His heart sank before he even opened them. As he unfolded each notice, each warning, each letter from the bank, he felt something inside him twist. His parents were drowning. They were weeks away from losing the house, and no one had said a word. He sat on the edge of the couch, letters spread around him like pieces of a life falling apart. He imagined his mother's prideful silence, her refusal to ask anyone for help, especially him. He imagined his father pretending everything was fine, the way he always did. They would rather lose the house than admit they needed their disappointment of a son. And yet, despite everything, Evan couldn't let them end up homeless. Not because they deserved saving, but because he still loved them, even if they never made room for him in their hearts. That week, he picked up every extra shift he could. 10-hour days became 16. His co-workers joked that he lived in the garage, but he just smiled and kept working. He sold his truck, the one thing he'd bought for himself in years. He canceled plans, stopped going out, put off moving to a better apartment. His entire life shrank to one mission: save the house his parents didn't know how to save themselves. Every month he made the payment quietly, carefully, slipping into the bank before work, making sure no letters made it back to the house. He never told them. He didn't want thanks. He just wanted them safe. But while he was breaking his back to keep the roof over their heads, they were busy bragging about Mara. Mara, the real success. Mara, who floated from job to job, never paying a single bill, yet somehow always got praised for trying her best. At every family gathering, Evan heard the same thing. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" They didn't know he was the one keeping them afloat. They didn't know Mara hadn't even offered to cover a single utility bill. They didn't know their golden child spent more money on weekend trips than Evan spent on himself in an entire year. He felt the weight building, month after month, the exhaustion, the resentment, the quiet ache of never being enough. But he kept going, even when the overtime ruined his sleep. even when his friends drifted away. Even when he felt himself fading, becoming nothing but a shadow holding up a house for people who would never see the sacrifice. He kept helping anyway, because that's who Evan Mercer was. And that was why the betrayal, when it finally came, cut so deep. Mara Mercer had always walked through life as if the world owed her applause. At 26, she was the kind of woman people noticed instantly. Charismatic, charming, the type who could smile her way out of any consequence. Growing up, Evan had watched their mother float after Mara like she carried her on an invisible pedestal. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" was practically Diane's greeting every time he entered a room. And Mara loved it. She thrived on being the favorite, the chosen one, the perfect daughter in her mother's eyes. What Evan didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was how far Mara went to keep that pedestal tall. While he was breaking his back at the auto shop, Mara was quietly feeding their parents lies. Whenever Diane complained that Evan didn't visit enough, Mara would sigh dramatically and say, "He doesn't care, Mom. He never helps with anything." When bills piled up, she blamed Evan's selfishness, even though she hadn't contributed a single dollar to the household in years. If Evan bought himself new work shoes, she twisted it into proof that he only cared about himself. The more their parents believed her, the more power she gained. And she loved that power. Mara resented Evan deeply, though she'd never admit it aloud. She hated the fact that Evan, the quiet one, the boring one, somehow managed to be stable, responsible, and financially secure. She'd hop from job to job, charm her way into promotions, then lose everything because she couldn't wake up on time. But their parents always made excuses for her. It drove her crazy that Evan didn't need excuses. It drove her crazier that Evan, with no bragging, no need for praise, had built a life more solid than hers. She wanted their parents' full attention, full praise, full sympathy. And the easiest way to get that was to turn them against the one person who refused to worship her. When Evan revealed the $61,000 he had paid, Mara's stomach twisted. Not with guilt, but with panic. If they believed him, everything she'd built, every lie she'd woven would unravel. So at dinner, when their mother slammed him with insults, Mara sat back and smiled into her glass. She didn't try to stop Diane. She didn't try to calm things down. She enjoyed it. Every cruel word Diane threw at Evan was validation of the story Mara had spent years crafting. And when Evan finally snapped and exposed the truth, Mara didn't hesitate. "He's lying," she said with practiced confidence. "He's just trying to make us feel bad. He wants attention." Her voice was calm, almost bored, as if she were correcting a child caught stealing cookies. She even laughed lightly, like the idea of Evan doing something so generous was absurd. The look she gave him then, sharp, satisfied, almost triumphant, was the first hint of just how deeply she had carved herself into the wedge that separated him from his parents. And Evan, stunned and heartbroken, realized too late that the person smiling at his pain had been shaping it all along. The room went so quiet after Evan revealed the $61,000 that he could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. Diane stared at him like he had spoken another language, her face stiffening before twisting into something sharper, something defensive and ugly. "You did that to make us look weak," she snapped, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "Don't stand here and act like you're some kind of hero." The words hit Evan harder than he expected. He hadn't come to embarrass anyone. He had come because he was tired of being belittled, tired of carrying a weight no one else seemed to notice. But Diane wasn't listening. She never listened. Before he could respond, Mara leaned in with a smirk that made Evan's stomach twist. "He's lying," she said easily, as though she had rehearsed this moment. "He just wants attention. He probably made one payment and thinks that counts as saving the house." The confidence in her voice, the way she tilted her head like she was patiently explaining something obvious to a child, it infuriated him. Mara had spent years painting him as the useless sibling, the selfish one, the one who never helped. She wasn't about to let the truth undo that. Evan looked to his father, hoping for support, or at least acknowledgement, but Ralph just sat there frozen. His brows were pulled together in confusion, like he wasn't sure who to believe. But he didn't speak. He never spoke when Diane was worked up. Silence had always been his shield, even if it cut Evan in the process. So Evan reached into his bag with trembling hands and placed the stack of papers onto the table. Receipts, payment confirmations, bank letters, foreclosure notices. Everything he had saved because some part of him had known deep down that this moment might come. He slid them forward quietly, not saying a word. Diane's eyes flicked over the documents, widening for a split second before she looked away quickly, her chest rising and falling faster. The shame was there, visible, raw, but instead of softening her, it hardened her into something almost cruel. She pushed the papers away as if they burned her. "So what?" she said, voice cracking. "You want us to fall at your feet? You want applause? You think waving some papers around makes you better than us?" Her words were unsteady now, unraveling, shaking under the weight of truth she didn't want to face. Mara leaned back, jaw tight, eyes darkening as her lies crumbled. Ralph's silence grew louder, almost painful. Evan tried to speak, tried to explain he never wanted praise, that he just wanted respect. But Diane cut him off, slamming her hand onto the table. "If you want to act like a martyr, then leave," she hissed. "Get out of my house." The words hung in the air like a slap. And with that single command, Evan finally understood. Even the truth wasn't enough for them. They would rather lose him than face what they had done. Evan drove home in a blur, barely remembering the turns he took. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel, his chest tight like something inside him was collapsing in slow motion. By the time he reached his small apartment, the weight of everything hit him at once. He closed the door behind him and slid down to the floor, letting the silence finally swallow him. The humiliation, the shouting, the disbelief in his father's eyes, the cruel satisfaction in Mara's smile. Every moment replayed until it felt unbearable. He buried his face in his hands and felt a familiar ache rise in his chest. This wasn't new. This wasn't surprising. Somewhere deep down, he had always known this was how it would end. His mind drifted back to childhood, memories surfacing like ghosts he had tried to forget. He saw himself at 8 years old, standing in the kitchen holding a drawing he had worked on all week. Mara had scribbled on hers 10 minutes before dinner, but their mother had framed her picture and tossed Evan's into a drawer. "Mara has talent," Diane had said proudly. Evan, well, at least he tried. He remembered being 15, bringing home a report card full of A's. Diane glanced at it once before asking, "Why isn't your handwriting neater?" But when Mara scraped by with C's, the whole house celebrated like she'd won a scholarship. And Ralph, quiet, tired Ralph, just stood in the background, offering Evan a small smile that never translated into protection or praise. He thought about the Thanksgiving when Mara broke his favorite watch, laughed, and said, "Oops," while Diane told him, "Stop being dramatic, it was cheap anyway." He remembered birthdays forgotten, punishments given without reason, and the endless comparisons that chipped away at him piece by piece. So why had he sacrificed so much? Why had he worked himself to exhaustion to save their home? Why had he believed, hoped, that one day they might see him, appreciate him, love him the way he had always loved them? He leaned his head back against the wall, staring at the ceiling as a painful truth settled in his chest like cold cement. They would never value him. Not for his work, not for his loyalty, not for his sacrifices. In their eyes, he would always be the disappointment, no matter what he did. He exhaled shakily, wiping his face with the back of his hand. For the first time in his life, he let the anger stay instead of burying it. He let the betrayal settle instead of excusing it. He let the reality of their treatment sink deep enough to harden him where he had always been soft. And in that moment, Evan made a quiet, unwavering decision. He wasn't paying another cent. Not another bill. Not another mortgage payment. Not another sacrifice to people who couldn't even say thank you. They had drained him for years. But tonight, finally, the bleeding stopped. It didn't take long for the consequences of Evan's decision to make themselves known. Within weeks, foreclosure notices started arriving at the Mercer house again, their red letters screaming the truth that Diane had managed to ignore. The first call came in the middle of the afternoon, the bank's automated voice cold and unyielding, explaining that payments had stopped and the account was now in default. Diane froze, staring at the phone like it had betrayed her personally. For years, she had assumed Evan would always quietly fix everything. She had assumed he would always bail them out. Now, reality was crashing down. By the next day, Diane had stormed over to Evan's apartment, slamming her hand on the door and demanding entry before he could answer. Her eyes were wild, her cheeks flushed with a mix of panic and rage. "Evan," she shouted the moment he opened the door. "I don't know what's wrong with you. Family sticks together. You can't just abandon us like this. You have to pay the house. You have to fix it." The words poured out, each one sharper than the last. The same woman who had called him a failure only weeks before now framing him as the villain for refusing to play savior. Evan took a deep breath, holding the door firmly in his hands. For the first time in his life, he felt calm. He looked her in the eyes without fear, without pleading. "I'm not paying anymore," he said simply. No excuses, no anger, just quiet certainty. Diane's face went from disbelief to fury as her voice rose. "Ungrateful. Selfish. Evil. How could you do this to us? After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me." He could feel the years of manipulation, of belittling, of unfair comparisons, pressing against him like a weight he had carried for far too long. But this time, he didn't respond. He didn't justify himself. He didn't beg for her understanding. He simply stood, silent, letting the truth sit between them like a wall too high to climb. Diane's voice cracked mid-rant, desperation leaking through the anger. "Evan, don't you dare leave us to rot." But it was too late. He slowly closed the door on her mid-sentence, the click of the lock echoing in the small apartment like a punctuation mark on years of suffering. Outside, Diane banged on the wood, shouted his name, tried every threat she could think of. But Evan stayed inside, breathing, steady, finally free from the chaos she had built around him for decades. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight lift. He didn't need to rescue them. He didn't need to fix the house or their lives. He had spent years sacrificing, and it had never been enough. Now, the natural consequences of his decision, foreclosure notices, angry shouts, a mother who could no longer control him, were proof that he had done the right thing for himself. And as the sound of Diane's voice faded, replaced by the quiet hum of his apartment, Evan felt a strange calm. He hadn't won anything in the traditional sense, but for the first time, he had claimed his own peace. Mara's confidence began to crumble almost immediately after Evan stopped covering the bills. She had always relied on the cushion he provided, the invisible safety net of his sacrifices, and now it was gone. At work, her habitual lateness became a problem she could no longer charm her way out of. Meetings she skipped, deadlines she ignored. Excuses that had once been forgiven were now catalogued and documented. Her boss finally called her in, frustration clear in his voice, and told her she was no longer a fit for the position. Mara left the office that day, her carefully constructed image of competence shattered, her smirk gone. She had been so used to people picking up the slack for her that the consequences felt almost foreign, almost cruel. Within a month, Mara had moved back into the Mercer house, dragging all her problems with her. Her rent-free lifestyle now became a daily drain on her parents, who had no choice but to deal with the bills that once fell silently on Evan's shoulders. Diane, who had been so quick to scold Evan, now watched helplessly as Mara demanded groceries, gas money, and help with unpaid bills. The house became tense, filled with Mara's complaints and arguments, her charm no longer shielding her from the truth. Diane, who had prided herself on being a careful judge of character, found herself facing the consequences of favoring a daughter who couldn't stand on her own. And yet, instead of recognizing her own misjudgment, Diane directed her anger where it had always gone. She stormed through her home, blaming Evan for leaving them in this mess. "If you hadn't abandoned us during hard times, we wouldn't be in this chaos," she shouted, throwing her hands in the air. Her voice dripped with the same pride that had once dismissed Evan's hard work, twisting reality to make him the villain, even when it was Mara's failures that had caused the strain. Ralph, quiet and passive as ever, sighed and shook his head, knowing the truth but unwilling to speak up. Meanwhile, Evan's life moved forward in a way that would have seemed impossible months before. At work, his dedication and skill were finally recognized. He was promoted, given opportunities he had long deserved but never sought because his time had been consumed by supporting a family that didn't appreciate him. His days were no longer dominated by stress, guilt, and exhaustion. He began to sleep soundly again, to enjoy meals without tension, to reconnect with friends he had neglected. The quiet confidence he had suppressed for so long started to grow, and with it, a sense of stability he had never thought he'd achieve. The contrast between Evan's life and Mara's became impossible to ignore. One sibling, praised for nothing and now reeling from the fallout of her own irresponsibility. The other, steady, reliable, and finally allowed to thrive. The house that had once been saved by Evan's secret efforts was now filled with chaos, blame, and frustration. Mara's failures could no longer be hidden. Diane's favoritism had backfired, and Evan, for the first time, could simply watch life unfold without being the scapegoat. The real failure, it seemed, was no longer him. By the time foreclosure notices started piling up on the Mercer kitchen counter, Diane and Mara had shifted into overdrive, their combined guilt and panic twisting into accusation. Diane's voice was sharp and relentless, each word a weapon honed by years of favoritism and resentment. "You're ruining this family, Evan. Do you even care that we're losing everything?" she shouted, slamming her hands on the countertop as Mara nodded furiously beside her, adding her own venom. "If you hadn't abandoned us, none of this would be happening. You're selfish, ungrateful, and cruel." Evan listened quietly, the weight of their words pressing down, but something inside him had finally hardened. He had watched them manipulate situations his entire life, gaslight him into guilt, and elevate Mara's failures while ignoring his sacrifices. Now, watching them weave fear and blame around him, he realized that no amount of proof or reasoning would penetrate their denial. They weren't just angry. They were desperate to maintain control, to twist reality to their favor, even at the expense of truth. The manipulation escalated when Mara brought up health scares. "Mom thinks your heart could fail because of all this stress," she said, her tone sharp and theatrical, trying to tug at Evan's conscience. Diane added, "I've been having trouble sleeping, Evan. This stress is literally killing me. Do you want me to end up in the hospital?" Their faces were masks of panic, their voices pleading yet accusatory, trying to bait him into guilt. Evan felt a flash of anger at the audacity, a lifetime of lies and manipulation culminating in this ridiculous performance. It was then that Ralph finally spoke, his voice quiet but heavy. "Evan, I knew about the payments all along," he admitted, looking down at his hands. "I just didn't say anything. I didn't want to make Diane angry. I thought it was easier to stay silent." The words hit Evan harder than anything Diane or Mara could say. His father, the one person he had hoped might understand, had kept the truth from him, silently allowing the years of manipulation and disrespect to continue. The betrayal cut deep, not because of the money or the silence, but because it came from someone he had trusted to be on his side, even quietly. Evan swallowed, his mind clear for the first time in years. He had carried the weight of their family's needs, their pride, and their lies for too long. He had given everything he could, only to be accused, blamed, and manipulated again. And now, with his father's admission, the final pieces of his decision clicked into place. He wasn't saving them anymore. He wasn't buying their forgiveness, their approval, or their gratitude. "I'm done," Evan said, his voice calm, measured, and unwavering. Permanently. He didn't raise it, didn't argue, didn't try to persuade them. He simply said it once, letting the finality hang in the room. Diane's mouth opened, ready to fire another insult, but Evan turned and walked away, leaving the accusations, the manipulations, and the betrayal behind him. For the first time, he felt the weight lift, leaving nothing but a quiet certainty. He would no longer let them control his life. The morning the bank finally took the Mercer house, Diane stormed through the neighborhood, her voice loud and accusatory as she contacted relatives and neighbors. "Evan did this," she declared to anyone who would listen, painting him as the villain who had abandoned the family during their greatest need. Mara nodded along, her own face a mask of outrage, adding details that twisted the truth even further. "He refused to help, and now look at what's happening." Their words spread like wildfire, whispers and judgment rolling through the extended family. People Evan had grown up around looked at him differently, some shaking their heads, some casting pitying glances, convinced he had chosen selfishness over family. Evan felt the sting of their disbelief, the weight of their silent accusations pressing on him. But he refused to argue in anger. He took a deep breath, gathering himself before contacting a few key relatives, presenting everything he had meticulously saved over the years. Receipts, bank statements, payment confirmations, foreclosure notices. One by one, he laid the truth bare, calmly explaining that he had quietly been the one keeping the house afloat for 2 full years. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He simply presented the evidence. The shift was almost immediate. Faces that had looked at him with judgment now betrayed shock and, slowly, understanding. They realized they had been manipulated, drawn into a narrative carefully crafted by Diane and Mara. They saw how Diane had elevated Mara while minimizing Evan's sacrifices, how Mara had twisted small actions and fabricated lies to maintain her favored position. The family murmured among themselves, exchanging glances that acknowledged the deception. Diane's face paled as the truth became undeniable. Her reputation, once solid in the eyes of relatives, began to crumble under the weight of Evan's proof. No one could deny the clear record of his actions, the months of quiet support that had kept their home safe. Mara, too, felt the consequences of her choices. With the lies exposed, she lost the remaining support she had leaned on. Friends, relatives, even casual acquaintances who had once admired her charisma now saw her for what she was: self-centered, manipulative, and ungrateful. Ralph, Evan's father, approached him quietly one afternoon, away from the gossiping relatives. His eyes were filled with regret, and his voice trembled. "Evan, I'm sorry. I should have said something. I should have stood up for you." Evan listened, the sting of betrayal still fresh, but he didn't allow himself to be swayed. He nodded politely, acknowledging the apology, but made it clear there was a boundary now. He wouldn't be drawn back into the cycle of manipulation and silence. The past couldn't be undone, and trust once broken would not be lightly rebuilt. With the house gone and the truth exposed, Evan felt a strange sense of liberation. Diane's power over the family had diminished, Mara's influence evaporated, and Ralph's cautious recognition was no longer a source of conflict. He had been vilified, betrayed, and blamed, but in the end, the facts had spoken for themselves. The family had to face the reality they had ignored for so long, and Evan, for the first time, could step back and live free from their judgment, free from their manipulations, and free from the weight of a role he had never wanted to play. Evan stepped across the threshold of his new home and paused, taking in the quiet hum of a space that was entirely his own. The walls were bare, the paint fresh, and the floor smelled faintly of new beginnings. For years, he had postponed moments like this, delaying his own life while quietly carrying the weight of his parents' mortgage, their bills, their expectations. Now, for the first time, he had something that was just for him. Small, modest, but entirely free from the burden of anyone else's entitlement or manipulation. He spent the next weeks slowly settling in. Shelves went up, tools and gadgets found their places, and little touches, plants, pictures, a worn but comfortable chair, made the space feel like home. Evan rediscovered hobbies he had neglected. Tinkering with cars, woodworking, cooking meals he actually enjoyed. Friends who had drifted away over the years returned, drawn back by his steadiness and quiet presence. Conversations were easy, laughter genuine, and for the first time in decades, he could rest without anxiety threading through every moment. Meanwhile, Diane and Mara were forced to adjust to life in a cramped rental, the house they had clung to now gone. The same family that had once been supported by Evan's sacrifices was suddenly forced to reckon with their own choices. Diane spent hours lamenting, blaming everyone around her except herself, while Mara squabbled over money, missed deadlines, and tried to recreate the charm that had once shielded her. Their world had tightened, and yet Evan never called, never gossiped, never gloated. He simply allowed them to live with the consequences of their own actions, quietly and calmly. Ralph, after months of witnessing the chaos and toxicity that Diane and Mara fostered, finally made a choice of his own. He left them, seeking distance from the suffocating environment they had created. Evan learned of it through a mutual friend, and instead of feeling vindictive, he felt only a quiet acknowledgement that some people simply cannot change. It was neither victory nor celebration, just understanding that life moves forward, and some bonds are meant to be left behind. Evan's revenge, in its purest form, required no words, no confrontation, no triumphal announcements. He didn't need to see Diane or Mara stumble to feel satisfaction. His revenge was the steady rhythm of his own life. Stability, peace, genuine relationships, and freedom from toxicity. Each day he woke without dread. Each night he slept without guilt or obligation. And each meal he cooked for himself was a quiet affirmation that he had chosen himself for the first time. Sitting in his small backyard one evening, Evan watched the sun dip behind the trees, the soft breeze brushing his face. He realized something profound. The most powerful revenge isn't about making someone else suffer. It isn't about showing them what they lost. True revenge, the kind that heals instead of destroys, is walking away from the people who break you and building a life that they can't touch. And in that moment, Evan Mercer finally felt free. Do you think Evan made the right choice by cutting ties with his family? Or should he have kept helping them despite everything? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. And if stories like this inspire or move you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.